Today, we're going to talk about something that shapes our world in ways we barely see. We're talking about water and the massive problems that come up when it crosses the lines we've drawn on our maps. This is about survival, it's about economics, and it's even about peace itself. So, let's dive in.
Really think about that for a second. If a river starts in your country but flows through mine, who gets to call the shots? Who gets to build a dam? And what in the world happens when there just isn't enough to go around? This is, hands down, one of the trickiest challenges in international relations. All right, so here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll get a sense of just how many rivers we're all sharing. Then, we'll get into the global playbook that's supposed to help manage them and see what happens when those rules get tested in the real world. We'll also look at why that playbook doesn't always work and wrap up by asking the biggest question of all. Where are we headed? Cooperation or conflict? So here's the basic problem, right? You've got literally hundreds of river basins and lakes that are shared by 2, 3, sometimes even more countries. Water is this shared lifeline, but the big decisions about it, well, they're often made by just one nation, and those decisions can have huge, sometimes even devastating impacts on their neighbors downstream.
It's pretty clear that to deal with this, the world needed some kind of a guide, a modern playbook for how to share water without, starting a fight. And that's exactly what a group of really smart legal experts decided to create. And this is it. The Berlin Rules. Put together by the International Law Association back in 2004, this framework was a total game changer. Why? Because it moved the conversation beyond just arguing over who gets how much water. It built on older ideas by putting sustainability, protecting the environment, and the idea of water as a basic human right at the center of the discussion.
Okay, but equitable and sustainable. What do these rules actually look like in the real world? Let's take a look at how these big principles play out on the riverfront with some really powerful examples.
So the heart of the Berlin Rules is this idea of equitable and reasonable use. Now, that doesn't mean everybody gets an exactly equal slice of the pie. What it means is that access has to be fair. You have to consider the needs of everyone who relies on that water, from farmers to entire cities, especially when one country upstream has the power to basically turn off the tap.
And if you want a textbook success story of this idea in action, look no further than the Indus Waters Treaty between India and Pakistan. We're talking about two nuclear-armed rivals with a long, difficult history, and yet, for decades, they have successfully shared the waters of the absolutely vital Indus River system, based on a set of rules they both agreed to. And get this, the treaty was signed way back in 1960. The fact that it survived multiple wars and crises is just incredible. It's a real testament to having a predictable framework, one that was brokered by the World Bank, that clearly lays out who gets which rivers. And for the most part, both sides have stuck to it.
But for every success story, there's a cautionary tale. And the Aral Sea is probably the most tragic example of what happens when these principles are totally ignored. It's a story of ecological collapse, yeah, but it's also a story that hits right on the Berlin Rules idea that access to water is a fundamental human right.
So here's what happened. Massive Soviet-era irrigation projects just diverted the rivers that were feeding the Aral Sea to grow cotton in the desert. The result? Its volume shrank by a staggering 90%. And this wasn't just some environmental oopsie, it was a human catastrophe. It led to the total economic collapse of fishing communities and created massive health problems from toxic dust storms.
The Berlin Rules also zoom in on the environment, and they introduce this really critical concept of environmental flows. This isn't just about water for us, for people. It's about making sure there's enough water left in the river to keep the ecosystem itself alive, to protect biodiversity and keep the water clean. To make that less abstract, let's talk about the Mekong River. Its natural flood and retreat cycle is the lifeblood of the Tonle Sap Lake in Cambodia, which is this incredibly productive fishery. We're not just talking about a lake, we're talking about a fishery that feeds millions of people. If you start messing with the river's flow upstream with dams, you are directly threatening that vital food source.
And you can see exactly how this chain reaction works. An upstream dam gets built, usually for hydropower. That dam then traps all the nutrient-rich sediment that's supposed to flow downstream. Without that constant supply of new sediment, the river delta, like Vietnam's incredibly fertile Mekong Delta, literally starts to erode and sink into the sea. And this, as you can imagine, is a major source of tension between upstream countries like China and Laos and a very vulnerable downstream Vietnam.
So, what's the answer? Well, it all points to one thing: cooperation. The rules are really clear. The countries need to be open with each other, sharing data on water flows. They need to have clear ways to solve disagreements before they blow up, kind of like the commission that oversees the Indus Treaty. And, super important, they have to involve the local communities in decisions that are going to affect their lives and how they make a living.
Now, as great as this framework sounds, it's not a magic wand. There are some very real limits to how effective these rules can be, which brings us to the challenges on the ground. And here are the two biggest hurdles. First off, the Berlin rules are what's called soft law. They're powerful guidelines, for sure, but they aren't a legally binding treaty. There's no global water police that can force countries to follow them. And second, climate change is a massive wild card. It's making rainfall less predictable and droughts more severe, which just turns up the pressure on every single drop of water.
All of this brings us to that final critical question. As our planet gets hotter and more crowded, what does the future actually hold for the water we all share?
So here's the bottom line. The Berlin Rules give us an excellent, really thorough roadmap for how to manage water fairly and sustainably. They show us a path away from conflict. But let's be honest, a roadmap is pretty useless if nobody is willing to follow it. At the end of the day, peace on the riverfront comes down to political will and real, genuine cooperation.
And that leaves us with this final thought. We have the playbook for cooperation. We've seen what happens when we use it, and we've seen the disasters that happen when we ignore it. The big question for all of us is, in a world that's getting thirstier every single day, will these rules be enough to keep the peace?